Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here at iPres for the first time at iPres for me. So my name is Tomasz Neugebauer, and I'm working at Concordia University as a digital projects and systems development librarian. And over the course of the last 4 years or so, I was responsible for leading the development of an integration between ePrints, which is an open source repository system, to and Archivematica, which I assume everyone here knows Archivematica, which is it's an open source preservation system. And to summarize the integration, what it consists of is, on the ePrint side, an export plugin that packages the objects and the metadata and saves these to a specified location. And on the Archivematica side, automation tools that watch this location and process new transfers that appear there and send back the UUID of the ape to ePrints on completion. So the integration plan between these two systems began in 2018 at the International Conference on Open Repositories, where I first presented the plan. And after some development, since the fall of 2021, we have been using this plugin in production to export digital objects and metadata from Concordia University's ePrints-based Spectrum repository to a dedicated Archivematica instance. So we have now exported the entire backlog of around 18,000 or so ePrints. So this presentation, we will describe this integration, explain how we are using it in our workflow, and we'll conclude with a discussion of hopefully of possible future enhancements for it. So a little bit of history of how the plugin was developed. So we used a GitHub repository hosted under the ePrints user group, which served as the common platform for refining the specifications and iterations of the software development since it was first proposed in 2018. We held virtual meetings as the plugin was being developed, with participation from the community. And here I want to thank, for example, George McGregor at the University of Strathclyde, who was one of the contributors really to that, and I think Strathclyde is also using the plugin. ePrint Services, also Artifactual, who was especially helpful actually in helping us set up like the workflow for how to do this in a community-based and really encouraging us to work through a repository like this to gather the feedback. And we also used conferences, Archivematica camps to discuss the specifications and push the development forward. And then the initial phase was really about fine-tuning the requirements in consultation with stakeholders. And then the beta version included some of the fundamental kind of configuration options, such as the location where to write the transfer objects, which kind of changes to an object trigger an export. And although the beta version included a metadata file intended for indexing and a checksum file intended to be checked by Archivematica, it really wasn't until the first release until both of these were included all of the kind of necessary details for the files to be truly interoperable. This is the transfer record folder structure. It was one of the fundamental questions actually for during the specification. The current version of as it is in the current version of the plugin, and so this assigns an Archivematica ID, which is assigned by ePrints to each transfer record as the top level folder name. And this was a practical decision in that Archivematica needs to send this ID back to ePrints on completion, along with the UUID. And the callback functionality can easily retrieve it from this folder name, which also ends up as the ape name inside Archivematica. And in the latest release, we also added the option to include a prefix for the repository name for those use cases where there's actually multiple repositories feeding into the same Archivematica, which I think is the case for Strathclyde, actually. So the current version uses two folders at the second level, one for metadata files and accompanying checksum file, and an objects folder with the deposited documents and derivatives. And this was a practical decision in that the object metadata split is something that is part of the Archivematica standard transfer. which is a structure that is documented by Archivematica as being well supported. And from the beginning, we kept an eye for other standard transfer structures, and it's possible that we might add an option in the plugin to export using, for example, the Oxford Common File layout. But we would have to have a compelling reason to do that, such as a more coherent integration with an archival system, for example, which for now, this Archivematica standard transfer gives us the best integration. So for example, indexing of the metadata within Archivematica that we send is possible through this structure. So this diagram shows the export process. It summarizes the export process, including the states of the transfer objects, which are created, processed, and archived, and some of the names of the scripts that are run at each stage. So processing transfers begins with the creation of an Archivematica record for each ePrint. And this is accomplished with a kind of a create transfers command line script or a trigger in case a live ePrint without a corresponding record is modified or created. Because there's kind of the backlog and then there's the new records. When created, the transfer is flagged as in need of export. And this flag can also be set by a trigger if a ePrint is changed. And then the process transfer script writes out those transfers in need of export and sets the state as processed. And lastly, when Archivematica processes that, it makes a callback and sends the UUID of this transfer back to ePrints so that it can be indexed as well inside of ePrints. So the plugin stores this UUID as a part of the log for each transfer record and changes the state to archived. So the Archivematica dataset inside of ePrints includes this log, which is accessible through a management screen in ePrints, summarizing the state history of the transfer, including the creation, modification events, and their timestamps, as well as any errors such as checksum mismatch or the many, for example, checksum missing in ePrints, which we encountered, various warnings along the way. And now we'll pass the mic to Sarah to talk more about what happens to this inside on the Archivematica side.
So, yeah, like Tomasz mentioned, the metadata file that's generated by the plugin contains some basic descriptive metadata about the ePrint, so things like the ePrint title, date, the author's name, and it's actually not only included within the ape, but this metadata is actually indexed for searching within Archivematica. So you can see in this screenshot of the Archivematica archival storage tab, you can actually search with, for example, the author's name in the transfer metadata and find the ape that way. And the plugin also generates a checksum.md5 file for every single file in the objects folder. And then it compares these with what's stored inside ePrints. So looking to flag any existing preservation problems with checksums during processing. And like Tomasz also mentioned, we do have a callback set up in Archivematica, which updates the item record in ePrints once an ape has been created and stored. So that's a screenshot of what that looks like inside of ePrints. You can see that there's the Archivematica UUID as well as the ape name, which is that first column there that's labeled as Archivematica ID. So this really serves as a confirmation in both systems that the ePrint has been processed and stored. And this was originally something that we thought would just be kind of a nice-to-have feature, but we ultimately decided it was essential to have both systems in communication with each other. So for our Archivematica workflow, we're using automation tools, which is a set of Python scripts to automate the processing of transfers in Archivematica. And this has allowed us to export batches of up to, I believe, 1,000 transfers at a time. And those transfers are really ingest from start to finish into Archivematica with no input on our part, thanks to a watched folder and an automated processing configuration. And doing this, we discovered that the Archivematica dashboard does become unresponsive after a few hundred transfers accumulate on it, but Artifactual kindly set us up with a script that will clear the dashboard every hour. After that, we had no issues at all. And so, as Tomasz also mentioned, we recently finished ingesting all of the backlog of live ePrints in our repository into Archivematica. And so now our next step is going to be to set up the plugin, so as a cron job, which will run to export any new deposits on a regular predetermined basis. So currently the only step of the workflow that isn't fully automated is deleting the completed transfers out of the watched folder once they've been processed with Archivematica. So we're doing that manually after each batch for now. It could be something that we look to automate in the future, but for now, the way we've been working has been working really well for us, and we're really happy with it. I just want to also say for our storage infrastructure, we're in the process of migrating our apes from local kind of provisional storage to the Ontario Library Research Cloud. So the OLRC is a cloud storage network that was initially created just for the use of Ontario university libraries, but they recently expanded to offer the service to universities throughout Canada. And with DuraCloud, which is the OLRC product that we're going to be using, our apes are replicated to 3 geographically dispersed, university-owned and operated data centers in Ontario that are connected through a private network. They also have automated regular fixity checking system in place, and the copies are self-healing. So it's really much more robust than anything that we could do in-house. And because it's run for a not-for-profit organization, it's more affordable than commercial cloud storage. So lastly, we just want to talk about our kind of next steps for the integration. We're currently looking into funding opportunities to make potentially some enhancements to the plugin. One example of that is that we'd really like to translate the plugin's processing logs into premise. So Archivematica can parse an imported premise.xml file into the main MITS file of an ape. And we decided that since this log represents a record of the preservation actions that were performed upon the objects, such as verifying the fixity, as well as exporting the transfer, we really thought that information should be packaged inside the ape alongside the other preservation metadata that's generated during processing. So you can see here a screenshot of a draft of what that premise.xml file would look like. And we would also love to hear your ideas or suggestions about what any other features that this integration could take in the future. And with that, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you both. At this point, we have questions. Immediately, we have a question here. Whilst the microphone's coming down, I'm going to ask mine quickly. ePrints and Archivematica versions, is your plugin version dependent on either of those?
Well, I could say that it shouldn't be. I started developing it on an older version of ePrints, so 3.1.3, or no, 3. Anyway, whatever it is, 3.2, 3.3? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 3.3.12 or something like that. And then we actually upgraded our ePrints to 3.4, and the plugin is fine because it's I think because it's really accessing some of the core functionality in terms of accessing the files that it has stored on the file system and so on. So I think it should be. But yeah, I didn't test it on earlier versions than 3.3, I guess.
Okay.
Leif Pettersson, Archivit, Sweden. What happens if there are new revision after you have archived? And do you save the revisions as well?
So yeah, this was obviously something that we thought about a lot. Right now, what happens is if there is, and that's where we kind of, the plugin is configurable in the sense of what consists of, what is a revision. And so you could configure it to watch for changes because there's the metadata and then there are actual objects, digital objects like a PDF document or a video or an Excel file. And so the only time that objects are exported is once that they've been made live. And so in theory, it shouldn't really change at that point because it's a publication. If there's a new version, that actually should become a new ePrint. However, in practice, there can be a change. And in that case, it would just generate a new ape, and it would be indexed as a new version of that ape within Archivematica. But yes, it would be just reprocessed again as a new entity. But this is something that we thought about a lot. And so, because I mentioned the Oxford common file layout, and there are other also packaging formats that attempt to sort of encapsulate multiple versions within the same item, but we don't do that here. We just have multiple apes for the multiple versions of the print.
We have an online question, I believe. Okay. Any other questions here? I dare say there will be discussion afterwards. I have a few more questions, but I will ask those afterwards. So can we applaud our first speakers?